We are going to move on now to the proposals. So what we have is about 15, 17 proposals. I'm going to end with discussing the CPA platform proposal and a couple of other proposals that people submitted and couldn't be here. So I will wrap things up, and we're going to start out with a wonderful proposal from Amy Farah Weiss, who I know from San Francisco, and she's been working with the homeless in San Francisco for quite some time. And her proposal is about safe, organized spaces for community shelter responses. So please welcome Amy to the stage.
So I come from San Francisco, which was originally Ohlone territory, and then was named after Francis of Assisi. And Francis of Assisi is an important figure to our work because he was a radical progressive activist who worked both within the system and outside the system to agitate. So I think that offers a really good model for us. And in San Francisco tonight, there are thousands of people who will sleep in crisis conditions on the street. How many people here live in a city or county where tonight thousands of people will live in crisis conditions on the street? Wow. How many people feel that the status quo of what their government doing is to scale to the size of the crisis? So really not. So today what I'm here to do is give a toolkit like Matt Gonzalez was talking about earlier, and also the mayor of SLO was talking about with, we have protests turned into policy. I've really been working with my organization and with a multi-stakeholder group to design a code-compliant framework for activating both public and private land for emergency shelter response. So Socrates is going to help me out here. This is, you might not be able to see this that well, but San Francisco, Los Angeles, Oakland, San Jose, and Paradise, and Chico, and Sacramento. We have allies throughout all of these places that are trying to activate land to deal with the crisis conditions that are happening tonight. And so once again, this is going to be a policy toolkit because there are some things that these places have in common. Next slide. In each of these places, there's a shelter shortage crisis. There's immediate public health and safety needs tonight, right? There's ongoing service gaps anticipated for this year and next year in all of these places. They don't have a plan yet. Cities are trying to activate monies to create housing and shelter, and that's wonderful. And there's still going to be a service gap tonight. And then we have immediate need for a code-compliant framework to activate land. So public-private partnerships. Please, next slide. What's wonderful is that what we've been activating for, in all these regions throughout California, the state of California building codes in December of last year, 2018, created this, and I have a copy of it right here if anyone wants to talk with me about it, and it creates the emergency shelter codes and all the services you need to be co-compliant at the state level. Next slide. So Safe Organized Spaces is saying that there's a crisis tonight and we need a crisis response that is oftentimes off-grid, but you need a framework that meets these state codes, and you also need a framework that makes it community integrated, and so that it's not just plunking down a village, a transitional village in a neighborhood, it's understanding that it is within a neighborhood and within a community and with the city, and there are best practices for how to do this, and we've built that toolkit. So it meets California state codes. It operates in partnership with property owners, neighbors, village residents, and service providers in coordination with the county. And we have an interim permit, a license agreement, insurance, baseline health and safety standards, a built-in process for multi-stakeholder input and evaluation, and site-specific agreements. Next slide. So what are our requested actions? Encourage California cities that have declared a shelter shortage crisis to activate these codes. And I have some shelter ordinance tools for that are included in this slideshow. So we want to activate, could you go back actually? So we want to be able to activate those codes locally with an ordinance and then be able to develop land. Number 2, encourage cities to create an interim permitting ordinance and protocol. And I have models for those as well included in this. And so we want to make sure that people are doing the right steps at their city council and their county supervisors to be able to work in compliance to activate land. Number 3, encourage cities to create incentives for leasing and subleasing vacant or underutilized private land. And so in Oakland, they just passed a vacancy tax. And so these empty lots and empty buildings, that money is going towards this kind of funding, and it gives incentives and disincentives to activate that land. Number 4, there's going to be statewide legislation. It's SB 48 to make it so that if you want to put a shelter in your community, you can do that by right. And we want to make sure that it's informed by these kinds of principles. And the last slide here. These are all the tools that I offer to you. So you might be overwhelmed at this point because this isn't your specific issue. But how many people here know someone in your area that's specifically working on activating land to deal with the shelter shortage crisis? It might not be you, but now you have this framework and toolkit that I happily share with you. And once again, we have regional allies all over the place. This gives you the sample drafts and the different ordinances that you can activate land. And there are also a couple folders for service providers, because in Seattle, this has been a successful program, and I've collected all of the models that of the paperwork for the intake forms, for the management plans, all those little details that make it really easy to build off of, but are sometimes hard to start from scratch. You know what I mean? So we're building off of what exists already, and my organization has been working on a budget for these off-grid transitional villages that meet state code. And that's also included in this packet here. And there actually is one more last slide. And you'll see that these are 2 shelters emergency shelter cabins that we built in San Francisco and people lived in while they were in transition. I have this information here available. Is this something that's gonna go out to folks in an email?
We will be showing the video on our website.
Okay, so if this is available, you can ask me. I have a card, and I'm happy to share this. And I saw all those hands go up for people who know people in different places. Please come up to me and give me your information or ask for mine, because we are doing this statewide networking, and I'm a pollinator for that kind of work. And I know that you know pollinators or maybe one yourself. So let's go ahead and actually meet the scale of the crisis for the people who are living on the streets. And once again, this isn't just for people who are displaced because of economic or behavioral challenges in their life. This is people being displaced in paradise and like where there are earthquakes. And I can't believe I still have time. I feel like I have this abundance of time. It's amazing. I'm looking for the person with the timer. Maybe she's not. I'm good. Okay. All right. Well, just go ahead and contact me. And SOS is the crisis. What's the solution? Safe, organized spaces. SOS is the crisis. What's the solution? And the beauty of this is that the framework is broad enough that it hits all those needs that cities and counties have for the specifics of this needs to be code compliant. I need to make sure that there's a community process. I need to understand how the staffing is going to support the needs of the population that's here. It's scalable, though. So it's very well designed in that way. And once again, people are already doing this kind of work. I'll alert you to this group in San Jose called San Jose Hope Village. And unfortunately, this group, very activist Catholic organization, decided to activate underutilized public land in San Jose near the airport. And they did it, and they've been doing it for months at virtually no cost to the city. And the city's gonna shut it down. They're doing that right now this weekend. And there are groups in Santa Cruz and Chico and Oakland that are doing this in different ways. There's all these iterations. Once again, what is this? This is the framework that we can use up and down the state to say at least it has to check all these boxes. And if it checks all these boxes, then you can do this in your community on public or private land.
Why are they shutting it down? I know the update to that until San Jose.
So, yeah, so there's information about that. But I'll just let you know a little bit more information. You know, we were able to activate an empty lot in San Francisco at the Impact Hub with one of our shelters for a year. And we've been doing this work in San Francisco to try to activate land because we see this as a crisis. And I see it as people say, well, what's the big resistance? And I see it as we're whittling down resistance and making it easier and easier to say yes and harder to say no. Safe, organized spaces. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy. That was beautiful. Thank you, Amy. I just want to mention that when I first met Amy, I heard about this, and it was at the same time as I was creating a homeless task force in Richmond, and I started advocating for it. And I don't know whether they heard about it after I was no longer on the council. I heard that they're taking the SOS, the Safe Organized Spaces policy up on the homeless task force. So your pollination is working. So now we're going on to another wonderful proposal, and this one is from Jim Pugh, and it's the California Prosperity Fund. So welcome, Jim, to the podium.
Thank you, Gail. I am so happy to be here today with all you amazing progressives. I'm Jim Pugh. I'm a co-director of the Universal Income Project. I so enjoy being in a space with people who are not just progressive, but are willing to dream big about what progressive means and think beyond just what is achievable today, what's achievable in a month, but where do we actually want to be going as a state and as a country? And that's really what my work focuses on and what I'm going to be talking about here today. So the California Prosperity Fund is a vision that we have for how we as California can begin to build towards a future that really embraces the idea of sharing prosperity and a state where we have enduring progress. I think I don't have to convince anyone in this room that while California embraces this role as a leader in progressivism, this mantle, particularly in the age of Trump, that we see ourselves as on the vanguard of that, we have so many issues that we're dealing with here. Every night, we have millions of people in our state, millions of families that are going to sleep hungry, that don't know if they'll be able to pay their rent. We have, by the supplemental poverty measure, we have the highest rate of poverty of any state in the country. And so while we have such immense wealth in the state, we're not actually achieving a vision of what full prosperity looks like. And if we want to do that, it's actually very simple how we do that, and that's to take our wealth and invest it in our people. Next slide. So a big first step that we see as being able to achieve this is to actually start as a state to build public wealth. We should create a state-run sovereign wealth fund that takes money that's publicly owned and invests it, with the goal of both getting a financial return on this investment fund, which would operate in a similar way to how our pension fund operates, but also to grow California's economy in an equitable way. Make sure that we are actually investing in the things that are really helping our people and building us towards an economy that works for all of us. That fund would be overseen by a prosperity council that would pull from the diverse segments of our state to ensure that we really have the representation that we need to be making those decisions in an effective way. And the returns on that fund would be, because this is public wealth, the returns on that would go to the people, and they would be paid out to Californians as dividends. And those dividends would take a few different forms. Next slide. Which aim to address really the biggest sources of inequality we have today and laying the groundwork for a future where we actually have lifted up everyone in our society. A top first priority would be to end deep poverty in California. Right now, there's sadly many, many Californians who don't even reach the threshold of deep poverty, which is half the federal poverty level. So those are the folks who are struggling most in our state today. We should immediately be taking the dividends from this prosperity fund and bringing payment, those people, the support they're receiving, up to a level where they're above that threshold. We also need to be investing in our children. The damage that children may incur if they're living in poverty as a youth will last for their entire lifetime. We need to be supporting our children and making sure that we're setting them on a path for long-term success. And finally, we should also be ensuring that everyone in the state is gaining and participating in our economic success. And we would do this through establishing a universal income as a prosperity dividend from this fund. So obviously a big question here, next slide, is where does this money come from? And we think that the right way to do this is to look at where the wealth concentration is today in California and take a chunk of that money, and all of us should have it. So there's many different ways of doing this. There's a few possibilities that I've listed up here. An oil severance tax, so that if people are taking oil out of the ground, we should stop them from doing that. But as long as they're doing that, we should make sure they're being taxed. We should have an estate tax, which California doesn't have right now. If you're a millionaire or a billionaire, you should be taking a chunk of that wealth and giving it to all of us. And we should be closing corporate tax loopholes in the state so that corporations who are offshoring their profits have to pay their fair share. All of this could start to quickly build out this prosperity fund. This is a long-term effort. This is something that would build over decades. But if we are ambitious and if we say this wealth is actually something we all share in, we can start quickly doing that, and we can really deal with the biggest challenges that we're facing today. So as far as the actions here, there's two main actions. One is for members here, I would ask that you vote to include the California Prosperity Fund as part of the California Progressive Alliance platform. And anyone here who is already or is thinking about running for office, I would ask that you consider including this in your platform to build a more equitable California. Thank you.